Well, good morning, good morning, good morning. Barry Jones, the Standards Plus History Academy. And we are continuing our series looking at the birth and growth of the deep state. And last week in chapters 1 through 3, we looked at the ultra vires principle, which started off as a governing principle of private industry and the rise of the corporations. They coincided. And then the Ultra Vires Act was passed, which codified into law the idea that corporations existed for one purpose, that was to maximize profits. They did not exist for the interest of the public. In fact, again, I can't emphasize this enough. A CEO or a board of directors could be fired if they were found to be acting in the public interest. It's all about maximizing profits for the shareholders. And then secondly, they had immunity. All the actors of the corporation, the CEO, the board, managers, whatever, uh, whatever liability they might fear they would have, they don't have because they're immunized. All the personal uh, actors were completely immunized from any sort of criminal or civil liability. And then the corporation itself, which was technically liable, found ways or mechanisms to immunize itself through spreading out its assets among subsidiaries and spreading out its income among shell companies or holding companies so that plaintiffs could not get at their assets in a civil action and government could not get income tax from the corporation because they had hidden their income amongst all these shell companies. So corporations are set up to grow. First of all, they're set up to exploit and take advantage of everybody around them, everybody who wasn't part of the system. And then they're set up to grow and make fantastic sums of money and become these humongous companies that are, in some cases, larger than and more influential than the government itself. And so, why are we surprised when in this next part of this series we start to see the influence of these corporations, which here at this point are still private sector? Okay. These folks, this, I gave you a teaser last week in chapter 3. I talked about how eventually, after the world wars, these actors in the private sector have been invited into the government, and now the ultravires governing principle from the private sector is fully immersed as the operating principle of the government as well. Um, until we get to those world wars and they get invited in, they will have major outsized influence, though, with the government, even though they're not actors within the government, because they're the ones who make all the campaign contributions. So, in essence, these 50 or 60, I call them the power elites, are not only controlling the corporations, they're controlling the US economy and they're controlling the United States government. So, why are we surprised, as we learned today, that their influence seeps into public policy? And as we know, history builds. And so you can't talk about imperialism, which is the next section, without first laying the groundwork, these rise of corporations, and correspondingly the rise of the ultra vires mindset governing principle. So today we're going to begin talking about the imperialist era, which is just the next step in this process as we see the evolution of ultra vires from private sector into public sector and into public policy. Uh, just to define it, imperialism is when the strong nations of the world use their political, military, and economic power to control and exploit, take advantage of weaker territories. And this isn't new. America is relatively late to the game, actually. I mean, Britain had the greatest imperialist empire in the history of the world at that time. They said the sun never set on the British Empire. And if you look at Britain, you can understand why. It's a small nation, sits on a rock, basically, it's an island, and they need a lot of the natural resources that they need to create the wealth that they want to create. It's not homegrown. It's not. they're not going to get it at home. In fact, they're not even able to grow enough food to feed their own people. They have to go out and colonize. And we know better than anybody almost what it's like to be colonized by Britain, because that's how we got our start. But they had other colonies spread all far and wide. But it wasn't just them. It was Spain, it was France, it was Russia, it was Japan. Everybody had colonies, and we were the last to join into this. And you think about it, our history as being a colony and how we rebelled against that notion that we would be controlled by some foreign power. It was sort of in our DNA to resist the colonization process. It would be sort of hypocritical. It would be more than sort of, it would be very hypocritical for us to think that we could colonize others when we didn't like being colonized ourselves. And yet, after the Civil War, we're going to participate in just that. So I want to talk about the reasons for imperialism, the five causes, and hopefully you'll be able to detect the influence of the rise of corporations that is simultaneous to this imperialist era. In fact, if you take the rise of corporations out of this scenario, out of this equation, most of these causes wouldn't even be necessary. It's because of the corporation and the rise of these huge corporations that we need these territories. For example, there's a lot of natural resources that these corporations are finding that they need, that they can get from overseas territories that they can't get here in America, or they can get them cheaper. And so one of the causes of imperialism is to extract from these foreign countries, these foreign territories, these natural resources, and I've listed a few here that these corporations need. Now, understand, the government doesn't need tea, the government doesn't need rubber, iron, petroleum. These corporations need it. Now, the government, by extension, might need it to build their armies or this or that, but it's the corporations that need these materials, these raw materials, these natural resources to produce whatever it is that they're producing. And so, with their links to Washington having subsidized pretty much all of the politicians that are in either the state houses and or Washington, they make known to Washington their desire as we proceed along. And I'll give you some specific cases today for these overseas territories in order to extract these raw materials. That's the number one cause. Number two cause is markets. We are now producing more than the American people can consume. And so these corporations, again, express a desire to their Washington constituents, basically, or their captured Washington politicians. Hey, we need access to these overseas territories so that we can sell our goods, the surplus of our goods, to overseas customers. Senator Albert Beveridge said, quote, "Today we are raising more crops than we can consume. Today we are making more than we can use. Therefore, we must find new markets for our produce." So as the corporations grew, as their production capabilities grow, the American population was not keeping pace. And so this overproduction threatened the bottom line. Anytime you have too much supply, the price goes down, right? So that's a supply and demand. So in order to keep the demand high, i.e. the price high, we need these overseas markets to keep the demand tight. So you'd say, well, why don't we just trade with these foreign countries? Well, some of these foreign countries don't want to trade with us. They grow their own, they have their own resources, they have their own products. But if we control these overseas territories, we control the trade. So we get to set the terms, so to speak. So two reasons so far. One is to get access to these raw materials so they can produce and produce and produce. And secondly is to get access to the markets so they can sell and they can sell, they can sell. This is all driven by the private sector in these corporations. Thirdly, is the necessity for military bases. If you're going to expand and create an overseas empire, I mean, the greatest example of this is Great Britain. Nobody had a navy like Great Britain because they needed that navy to control all their overseas colonies. You know, uh, that was the enforcement mechanism by which, no colony is willingly a colony. They have to be forced into that position and they have to stay forced under that position. And the military force that Great Britain accumulated or built was that enforcement mechanism. The United States is going to go through a similar situation where if we're going to, we're taking notes, we're watching what Britain did. We know that for us to have an overseas empire, we're going to need a bigger military. One of our first imperialist presidents was Teddy Roosevelt, and he used to be, uh, a high-ranking official in the Navy, and that became his obsession, was to create a Navy on par with Great Britain, so that we would be able to reach out and touch any of our overseas holdings and keep them as overseas holdings. And in order to do this, you need bases. You can't just have everything based out of America and then respond to a problem in the Philippines overnight. You need a base in the Philippines. You need a base somewhere in Asia. You need a base in Europe. You need a base here, a base there. That's land. So in order to get this military advantage, in order to support this overseas empire, we need a military that can, uh, be proactive and be seen, be visible, and keep everybody in line. That means we need land for bases. So to expand and protect our interests around the world, we need a navy. We need bases, which means we need land. So it all works together, right? So, Alfred T. Mahan was the U.S. naval officer who believed that all great nations used navies to dominate the world. And he was a very influential Navy man during this period of time. And his influence on the Navy itself, but on public policy specifically, and with presidents such as Teddy Roosevelt, became pretty obvious. And uh, we jumped on board his philosophy. So here's a third reason for imperialism. We need the bases for the military to keep and help spread the American empire further and further away from our shores. All right. So we've got first cause is we need raw supplies for the corporations. Second cause is we need markets for all the products these corporations are producing. Third cause is we need bases for the military, and because the military is going to be the enforcement mechanism by which we sustain and even grow our empire. So that's the third cause. The fourth cause is we've run out of empire or territory here at home. Frederick Jackson Turner wrote a thesis about what happens when we run out of frontier settlement or room for frontier settlement. Uh, all of the free land, cheap land that had been advertised to immigrants for years and years and years had done its work, and the frontier had disappeared. Uh, and by the time we get to the end of the Civil War, and in this period after the Civil War up to World War I, the frontier settlements had used up America's great safety valve. Frederick Jackson's Turner thesis was that one of the ways to keep peace, to keep harmony in a country, is to have a safety valve whereby you can release frustrations into empty land or new territory where people who have failed in their endeavors, perhaps to be a farmer in Ohio, can pick up and leave and go out to the west somewhere and start over. People who want to get out of the city and go search for gold can load everything up in a Conestoga wagon and head west in their search for gold. In other words, as long as we have land out there that's unoccupied, we have a release valve, a safety valve, a pressure release for people who need that and would otherwise cause problems where they were if they were forced to stay. But now they have a place to go and start over. And we don't have any safety valve left. We don't have any pressure release. We don't have any more territory that's unoccupied or not spoken for. You take the frontiers, you take the railroads, uh, the combination of those two just by themselves had filled up the West. I mean, all you have to do is study the story of the American Indians and how they kept getting moved around from first west across the Appalachians, then west across the Mississippi, then onto plantations. Then we moved them to different plantations. Once we discovered the plantations we originally put them on had gold or were in the way of the railroads or other valuable resources. And they kept getting their territory shrunk, 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 and shrunk. We fought a war with Mexico. We we just gobbled up all the land out there. So it's gone. So the safety valve is gone. The only safety valve left is now to look overseas. So if you ascribe to guys like Alfred T. Mahan, you know we need overseas bases for this Navy that's going to protect our empire. If you ascribe to Frederick Jackson's Turner thesis, you realize we need overseas territory for the safety and well-being, psychological and otherwise, of the American people and the success of our country going forward. We've got to have a safety valve. So that's the fourth cause. The fifth cause I won't talk too much about because we've already discussed it, is this mindset in America, we call it social Darwinism, that life is this competitive struggle, just like the evolution of the species. This is about societies and nations and peoples, and it's a competitive struggle amongst all these different nations and societies and peoples, and some survive and some don't. Some nations, according to this mindset, are superior to others. Some races are superior to others and destined to rule over these inferior people groups. It's not a hard extrapolation. We've already seen how it's working here at home internally, whereby the power elites consider themselves to be the fit and all the workers to be the unfit. Well, if you extrapolate that out, when comparing the American people, the American nation, to these other countries that we're going to be looking at and targeting, full of these, these foreign peoples and different races, etc. The natural extrapolation of social Darwinism is to say, well, we're more fit than they are. And in this competitive struggle, it's either us or them. So the idea of expanding into these foreign territories, creating an empire, fit the dogma or the philosophy of the times, which was social Darwinism. And in fact, Americans were worried if we didn't hurry up, the world was going to be spoken for. I use this picture or this illustration of Africa to demonstrate my point. If you look at the graph on the side, the legend, you see all these colors represent different imperialist empires. You have the British, which is orange. You can see how much of Africa Britain controlled between this period that we're talking about. Green is France. You can see how much France controls of Africa. And going down the list, one country that you'll notice is not listed there is the United States. At this point in time, Africa is spoken for. And Americans are looking around saying, my goodness, if we're going to be a world player, a power player on the world stage, we need an empire too. And right now, we don't have one. And these power elites are whispering in the ears of their rented politicians in Washington saying, we need resources, we need markets, we need military bases. We need land for bases, or you're going to have to put military bases on there to support this overseas empire. We need a safety valve, a release, a pressure release. And don't worry about the peoples of these countries. Yeah, they don't want to be colonized. Who cares? Life is a competitive struggle. It's either us or them. Right now, we're losing, and we have some making up to do. So the thinking was, if we don't get involved in this imperialist game, one day someone will come for us. We'll be the next target and we won't survive. Survival is of the fit. And of course, the power elites view themselves as the most fit, and America, as far as ranking the nation, as the most fit. So we should be involved in this competitive struggle to create this empire. And again, part of this mindset is it's all about maximizing profits. We're trying to create an empire so these corporations can get access to cheaper raw materials so they can produce more material, more goods and sell more goods to these overseas markets. All of it protected by the US military. And it's all about maximizing profits. And whereas ultra vires here in America meant public interest be damned here locally, on a world stage, public interest be damned means we don't care about the people. And social Darwinism is our excuse, it's our rationalization, it's our justification to exploit overseas people groups, just like we've been exploiting the American people groups, the immigrants who are coming here. So it's tailor made. The imperialist era is tailor made for this era and this belief system that we have. And so what I want to do next is start to show you examples of where we start to dabble. You know, our tradition prior to the Civil War was based on what George Washington said, our first president, when he warned us of foreign entanglements. And so we pretty much kept to ourselves. In fact, we had a Monroe Doctrine for years that told foreign countries to stay out of our affairs, and as a result, we would stay out of theirs. And so we were kind of isolationists uh, by choice because of the advice by President Washington, father of our country. But you're going to start to see a sea change here where the Monroe Doctrine gets added to and amended by the Roosevelt Corollary, whereby we start to tell other countries, well, now we have what we call a sphere of influence. And that sphere of influence doesn't just include the United States, it includes everything in our Western Hemisphere, which means we have a say in everything that goes on in the Western Hemisphere. So, in other words, the Roosevelt, and that's Teddy Roosevelt, our first imperialist president, adds to the Monroe Doctrine, whereas Monroe said, you stay out of our business, talking about the United States, we'll stay out of yours. And we held to that for many, many years. Roosevelt changed that and said, well, our business now includes all of the Western Hemisphere. And of course, we didn't ask any of the other countries in the Western Hemisphere whether they agreed with that, or they wanted our help, or they wanted our supervision, or they wanted our oversight. We just did it. In 1853, now this is going back a little bit before the Civil War, just to kind of give you the backstory and where when we start when this overseas uh, mindset begin, this expansion to overseas territory begins to take place. 1853 is sort of the first example of that. We sailed a fleet of American warships into Japan, Tokyo Bay there, and we, quote, negotiated a trade deal between the United States and Japan. Essentially, what we did is we made them an offer they couldn't refuse. If you've watched Godfather, you know what I mean when I say that. Remember that famous scene in Godfather where the consigliere, the Godfather, shows up at a movie director's house, and he says, he hands him a contract. And he says, one of two things is going to be on this contract when I leave, either your signature or your brains. So, the director didn't have much choice but to sign it. We sailed our U.S. naval fleet to Tokyo Bay. The leader of Japan wakes up one morning, looks out his palace window, and there's the United States naval fleet sitting on his front door. And we had been negotiating with Japan for a while. He'd been giving us the old stiff arm, raising the price, raising the terms. And so we decided, well, we're just going to sail our fleet into this harbor and we're going to jumpstart these negotiations, which have been stalled, and we're going to get terms that are friendly to us, or else. And that became an example for us to follow going forward, especially when you see the example of Hawaii, which we'll get to in a minute. But this is our first dabbling into negotiating with foreign governments for either in this case it's a trade deal. It's not overseas empire, it's just a trade deal. But we learned a lesson from that, and the lesson was, hey, we got some power, and what's it good for if we don't use it to our advantage to get something that we want? So that was sort of the first time we played the part of the bully. In 1867, just a couple years after the Civil War ended, we purchased a chunk of land from Russia. Now, this was legitimate. Russia offered it to us for sale, and it was because Russia needed money. You know, sort of like the Louisiana Territory or Louisiana Purchase all over again. France needed money. Napoleon needed money for his wars, so we got it cheap. Well, Russia needed money, and we got it cheap. Now, there was a lot of controversy back home in America. $7.2 million seemed like a lot of money at the time. It's nothing now, but it seemed like a lot of money at the time for what seemed like just a big chunk of ice. And Americans actually made fun of the government for purchase. They called it Seward's icebox. Seward was the negotiator working on behalf of the United States. Got the asking price of $7.2 million. Like, what on earth is worth $7.2 million in that frozen tundra? Well, obviously, the people that were uh, behind Seward and encouraging the purchase knew better, that there were resources up there. It's not, I wouldn't call it a real livable place. I know there's people that love to live up there, would kill to live up there. They love Alaska. It takes a special person. I wouldn't want to live there, but it's inarguable, especially as time has gone on, technology's improved. We've learned the extent of the resources available to us in Alaska. This $7.2 million price tag for Alaska, which was seen as a boondoggle back in 1867, is now viewed as the bargain basement. This is the greatest purchase. We fleeced the Russians for all these resources for next to nothing. It doubled the size of the continental United States at the time. It was our first non-contiguous territory, not attached. But again, that plays into the mentality, the psychology of what's fixing to happen. If we can purchase this land, which is closer to Russia than it is anything American, it's not overseas, it's attached, but it's not attached. And if you don't understand what I'm saying. This plays into the psyche of, well, if we can do that in Alaska, why can't we do it in Hawaii? If we can do it in Hawaii, why can't we do it in Cuba? If we can do it in Cuba, why can't we do it in the Philippines? If we can do it in the Philippines, why can't we? It just creates this domino effect. And of course, we all know now how many resources are available to us in Alaska. So this was a very fortuitous event, as it turns out, just kind of like the Louisiana Purchase turned out to be. Then again, in order to foster trade in our hemisphere between us and Latin America and South America, in 1889, we got together with 17 Latin American countries, and we agreed, and of course, this was led by the United States, to build a highway that connected South America and Latin America to the United States, and indeed all the way up into Canada. And that highway is still used to this day. And it was necessary to expand trade routes, right? Almost, when you get into these trade routes, is not anything new. You think about how America was discovered; it was in search of a trade route between Europe and Asia. Well, here we have these, obviously there's resources in South America that we'd like to get our hands on for our corporations back home. And of course, there's products in America from these corporations that we'd like to sell in Latin and South America. And so it's viewed as a win-win proposition, right? They get to buy our stuff and we get to buy their stuff. And so let's build a highway that connects it, makes this trade easy. Now, this is Grover Cleveland, president. who is one of the first presidents to make reference to the fact that Latin America falls within the United States, quote, sphere of influence. Thus, we have the right to sort of, we kind of told these countries we're going to build this highway with or without you because you're within our sphere of influence. Again, we're not asking these countries for their cooperation. We're not, well, let me rephrase that. We're not asking for their permission. We would like their cooperation, but we're not asking for their permission. We're the big behemoth in this hemisphere. We're the powerful United States. We're the colossus of the North, so to speak. So we're going to do what we're going to do. It'd be nice if you'd agree and go along with it. I mean, everybody could be real friendly, but we're going to do it, whether you like it or not. So what I really want to focus on the remaining time is what we did in Hawaii. Now, in Hawaii, we had some pretty important sugarcane planters, and the sugar industry is a behemoth. It's a monster. And it's even bigger today than it was then, but it was big then. And we had a sweetheart deal with Hawaii. It was not our territory. It was not our, it wasn't our state or annexed it. Yeah, it wasn't. It belonged to the Hawaiians, and they even had their own queen. Her name was Queen Lily Kalani. I call her Queen Lily for short. And we were exploiting Hawaii for their sugarcane, taking advantage of that. We had this little sweetheart deal with Queen Lily. And at some point, the Hawaiians didn't like the deal. They said the Americans are growing all this sugarcane. They're making lots of money off this sugarcane. They're giving us peanuts in exchange. So they wanted to raise the price. And really what they wanted to do eventually was kick the Americans out and keep all the sugarcane industry for themselves. And we could see where this was headed. So this is test case number one. We've sort of dabbled. We sent our military over to Japan, and just its presence was threatening enough to get the trade deal we wanted. We went to Latin America and said, we're going to build this highway with or without you. It'll be good for both of us. Hint, hint, wink, wink. And we got what we wanted. We bought Alaska from the Russians. Russians needed money. That was a friendly transaction. And in exchange, we started to find immediately the benefits were outweighed the costs because all the natural resources there. So we're getting a taste for this, right? We're getting an appetite for this imperialist, this expansion, this empire building stuff that all these other countries have been doing. We're starting to see why they've been doing it. So Hawaii becomes a problem all of a sudden. So we send in the United States Marines and we foment a little homegrown rebellion. It was completely instigated by us. And with the backing of the United States Marines, we get Queen Lily overthrown. She was a problem. She was standing in the way of us having access to the sugarcane fields, et cetera, that were prevalent there in Hawaii. And in her place, we put in charge a governor of Hawaii. His name is Sanford Dole. Sanford Dole owned, you're all familiar with Dole pineapple, right? Sanford Dole was the American sugarcane planter who later became the head of Dole. I don't know if they call it Dole pineapple or just Dole, but he was not a government official. He was a private sector corporate owner. And no doubt he was the one behind the United States Marines, the United States government coming in and overthrowing Queen Lily when he explained to them the facts of life. Listen, we're about to lose our access to Hawaiian sugar. And this whole industry depends on Hawaii being cooperative. And Queen Lily is not being cooperative. She needs to be replaced. So he is essentially calling in a favor. He and others in this industry have supported and given campaign donations to all these Washington politicians. So now it's time for them. He's ponied up. These industry guys have ponied up. And so now it's time for the public sector to respond and return the favor. And so they send in the U.S. Marines. They overthrow Queen Lily. Benjamin Harrison annexes Hawaii into the United States, which means it is now under in the U.S. sphere of influence. Later, McKinley proclaims Hawaii an official territory. Of course, we all know later it was added as a state. We stole Hawaii. Why? Because of the sugar industry. Now, the United States, this is such an important distinct, is so important, this understanding that the United States government is not in the business of growing sugar. Okay. These are private sector industries, private sector corporations that have gotten very rich, very powerful, producing the sugar amongst many other products that they're producing. They've become the backbone of the U.S. economy. They've become the subsidy. They've become the benefactors of all the Washington politicians. So that when they pull us, they're like Geppetto. Washington politicians are a bunch of Pinocchios, and these 50 to 60 power elites run these corporations are a bunch of Geppettos, and they just pull strings. They said, we want a highway into Latin America. Do it. Get us this highway. And American politicians run and get it. We want Russia. Buy it. It's got resources, so we buy it. We want Hawaii for the sugarcane. Queen Lily's a problem. Get rid of her. And we're not even going to hide our motives. We're not going to hide our intentions. We're not going to try to mask it by putting some government schlub in charge and pretend like he's in charge. He's not in charge. We all know that the power elites are pulling the strings. We'll just put our own guy in charge. We'll just skip the middleman. We'll put Sanford Dole in charge. And that's how we stole Hawaii. So you can see what's happening here. It starts off with this tepid little, make an offer that it couldn't refuse to Japanese. We saw, wow, it worked. It really worked. Then after the Civil War, it was the highway into Latin America. It was Russia buying Alaska from Russia. And now it's stealing Hawaii from the Hawaiians. And I wanted to tell this story so you could see that the momentum is picking up steam. And we're not making any effort to even hide what we're doing. We're there to get Hawaii's sugarcane. And as proof, the guy we put in charge has his own sugar company. You talk about a conflict of interest. That's the fox in charge of the hen house, right? Now, this is going to get replicated when we get into a war. What eventually happens in all of these scenarios is somebody stands up and says, wait a second, time out. You're not going to come in and just take our stuff. You're not going to just come in and take our land or whatever. And so this is when the Americans are going to realize, okay, sometimes this is going to require war or force, military power. And it's going to require a hammer. It's like Teddy Roosevelt said, speak softly, carry a big stick. His big stick was the Navy, right? And he's going to learn firsthand how that works in the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War is the gateway drug. It's like marijuana. Marijuana is the gateway drug, they say, into all these other drugs. Spanish-American War is the gateway war into all these wars of these foreign wars of conquest to come. All these foreign wars were protecting American assets and interests all around the world, so to speak. This empire that used to not exist now does exist. It gets us involved in all these foreign wars. And if we win, we come out with all kinds of goodies. And of course, it's going to be necessary to lie to the American people, right? So we'll have to cover that. It's going to be necessary to deceive even our allies who are helping us in these wars as to what our intention is. So we got to cover that. It's going to be necessary to have this massive military buildup so we can achieve all these goals. So we got to take care of it. It's going to completely change the direction of our country. And it's showing it's a peek behind the curtain, so to speak, to show who's really calling the shots. It's these corporate industrialists. You'll see when we get into the Spanish-American War. It's these corporate industrialists who see opportunity in these foreign countries, these foreign territories, to A, get their hands on cheap natural resources, B, expand their markets, have more people to sell their goods to, keep the supply and demand high, C, give land for military bases so the empire can continue to spread and we can continue to control it. It gives us a safety valve since we don't have any more land to develop here. And it plays right into that mindset of social Darwinism, which is we're the fit, they're not. They deserve to be conquered. In this struggle between this competitive struggle between people groups, we either kill or be killed. We we uh, we we expand or we shrink. We grow or we die, kind of a thing. So why are we surprised? After Civil War, ultra vires and the rise of corporations, and it starts off as a private sector thing. Now it starts seeping in. It has begun to seep into public policy, and our government is responding to the leverage instruments that these corporations have over them because they control the purse strings, and they're carrying out, doing the bidding of these power elites. Now, eventually, the power elites will be in our government. Right now, they're not. They're calling the shots from the private sector. And technically, the public sector is a separate entity. At some point, they're going to merge, and their interests are going to merge, and they're going to become one and the same. We're on our way to that point. I'm just building and taking you through the process. Okay, that's enough for today. Thanks for hanging in there with me, and I hope this is interesting to you. Feel free to subscribe to my channel. Feel free to smash the like button. Feel free to comment or share. And until next time, God bless. Thank you.